On the 8th of July, 1947, an FBI teletype out of Dallas described a disc-shaped object recovered near Roswell like a weather balloon with a radar reflector, and noted it was being flown to Wright Field for examination. You know the argument: balloon or saucer. People have argued it for 75 years. I want to ignore the argument and follow one-word examination because it points at a building, and a building is where the bodies are supposed to be. There is no autopsy report. There is no tissue sample. There is no pathologist's name from 1947, not one. And yet the anatomy gets described in more detail with each decade. So where did the body come from, if the paper stops at the door? Let me show you who built it, and when. It starts with the one piece of paper that is actually real. The teletype exists. You can read it. It was not leaked, and it is not disputed it was released, and it says what it says. A field office relaying that an object had been recovered near Roswell, roughly disc-shaped, associated with a balloon, and with something like a radar reflector hung beneath it. And a single administrative instruction: the thing was being sent on to Wright Field for examination. Read that word again. Examination. That is a plan, not a finding. It tells you where the object was going. It tells you nothing about what anyone found when it got there. There are no bodies in the teletype, no building number, no pathologist, no gurney, no small caskets, no anatomy of any kind. There is a destination. I'm not going to tell you what was in the object. The memo doesn't, so I won't. What the memo does is build a bridge, the strongest real bridge that exists between the town of Roswell and a particular set of hangars in Ohio. Everything else in this story is an attempt to walk across it. Start with what's on paper. The paper points at Wright Field. So the question becomes, why that building? Of all the buildings in America, before there was a legend, there was a rancher, and a press release nobody thought about for 30 years. The rancher was Mac Brazel. In the summer of '47, he found debris scattered across the Foster Ranch: foil, rubber, sticks, tape, the kind of wreckage that means nothing until someone decides it means everything. He reported it. The Army sent a man to collect it, Major Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer with the 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic bomb unit in the world at that time. That detail matters. This was the most security-conscious airbase on the planet, and its intelligence officer drove out to look at some foil in a field. Then the base information officer, a lieutenant named Walter Haut, put out a press release. It said the Army had recovered a flying disc. For a few hours on the 8th of July, that was the story on the wire. And then it wasn't. In Fort Worth, Brigadier General Roger Ramey stood in front of the same debris and called it a weather balloon and a radar target. The disc became a balloon before the ink was dry. The unit's own history recorded the mundane version, and the story died. Not for a week, for 3 decades. For 30 years this was a dead story. Nobody was chasing it. That matters, and we'll come back to why. No morgue, no autopsy tent, no small caskets, not in 47, not in any 47 document. Here's who was actually in the room: a rancher, an intelligence major, a press officer, and a general holding up a balloon. That is the entire real cast of the summer of 1947. Everyone else you associate with this story arrives later. To understand where they arrive, you have to understand what kind of place the paper trail was pointing at. To understand why the bodies ended up here in the story, you have to understand what really happened here. Wright Field sat outside Dayton, Ohio, and it was not a sleepy place. After the Second World War, it was one of the beating hearts of American air power research, testing, procurement, and something with a duller name and a stranger job: foreign materiel exploitation. Air Materiel Command was headquartered there, and when the United States got its hands on a captured aircraft, a strange engine, an unfamiliar radar set, that hardware very often ended up at Wright Field, on a bench, being taken apart by men whose job was to understand things that came from somewhere else. Follow the building, not the rumor. because that is the whole mechanism. A place that genuinely did receive mysterious machinery from foreign powers, behind fences, under guard, is the perfect place to imagine it also received a body. The secrecy was real. The work on unfamiliar technology was real. The legend simply borrows that reputation and asks it to carry one more crate. I keep wanting the secrecy to mean bodies. It doesn't. It means captured aircraft and radar sets and a filing system. That's the harder, duller truth. The building doesn't need an alien in it to explain why the story chose it. It only needs to be exactly what it already was. The Air Force's answer is boring, classified, and as far as the surviving record goes, sufficient. The unglamorous version first. There was a program called Project Mogul. In 1947 it was secret, and its purpose was almost comically far from flying saucers. Strings of high-altitude balloons carrying acoustic sensors floated up into the stratosphere to listen for the shock waves of Soviet atomic tests. Not one balloon. Long trains of them, with foil radar reflectors strung along the line. When the Air Force finally addressed Roswell in the 1990s, in a report called the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert, this is the object it pointed to. A Mogul train, come down in the desert. Look at the debris the ranch actually produced. Foil, balsa sticks, rubber, tape. That is not the hull of a starship. That is a balloon train, and the reason nobody in 47 would explain it plainly is that the program itself was classified. The unit history, in its own words, had already called it a radar tracking balloon. A radar tracking balloon. The secret being kept was real. It just wasn't the secret people wanted. I can't tell you Mogul is the whole story. I can tell you it is the explanation the surviving paper supports. Proponents dispute it, and they dispute it sincerely. This is the contested hinge of the entire case. But here is what I keep circling back to. If the answer is this ordinary, then why, half a century later, did the United States government go digging through its own vaults for a Roswell examination that supposedly happened at Wright Field? Somebody, officially, went looking. Let me tell you what they found. In 1994, a congressman got tired of the rumor and did the one thing nobody in the legend ever does. He asked the government to look. His name was Stephen Schiff, a representative from New Mexico. He requested a formal record search, and the General Accounting Office carried it out. The result is a real document with a real number, GAONSIAD 95 187, issued in 1995. The GAO went through Defense Department holdings, FBI files, the CIA, the National Security Council, and it followed the teletype's own lead. It went looking in the Air Material Command records for 47 through 50 for the examination the memo said was coming to Wright Field. It found no record of a Roswell crash there, no examination, no accession, nothing. Now here is the detail I keep returning to, and it is not a dramatic one. This is the part the legend needs you to skip. The reason the trail goes cold is a filing decision. The administrative records of the Roswell base for March 45 through December 49, and the outgoing messages for October 46 through December 49, had been destroyed. And the disposition paperwork, the form that records the destruction, does not say who ordered it, or when, or under what authority. A checkbox on an old routine form. Unsigned, decades gone. Missing records are not evidence of what was in them. Destroyed files are not destroyed alien files. That is the discipline the whole subject fails. And there is a second silence stacked on the first. The National Archives asked for the Project Blue Book file on Roswell. The Air Force's own UFO investigation reports that it holds no Blue Book documentation discussing the 1947 incident at all. So when someone offers you leaked Blue Book Roswell autopsy papers, understand what you are being offered. Documents from a file the archive says does not exist. I don't know what was in those destroyed Roswell records. Neither does the GAO. That's the whole point. Nobody does, and that emptiness is exactly where the story moves in. So let me do something the legend never does. Let me put the anatomy on a timeline. The body in this story gained an organ, then a building, then a face, then a diagnosis, and it gained them in that order, decades apart, each from someone whose name we know. I am not inventing categories. I'm observing them. 5 layers. Count them with me. First, the line, the memo to Wright Field. Then the building, a place to keep the body. Then the bodies themselves, someone to examine. Then the face, an image to believe. And last, the diagnosis, an anatomy, and a verdict. Off the calendar, not out of the air. Each one arrives on a date. Each one arrives from a person. Watch them arrive. The bodies needed somewhere to be. In 1974, someone finally gave them an address. His name was Robert Spencer Carr, a retired man with a University of South Florida connection and a gift for a good story. In '74, he went public. The government had recovered crashed saucers and the bodies of their crews, and those bodies had been autopsied and stored at Wright-Patterson. He gave the place a name that stuck to it like tar. Hangar 18. Watch the seam here, because that is the first thing in this entire account that is fully, cleanly invented, not misremembered, not classified, authored. No one ever produced a body. No one ever produced the hangar. And Carr's own son would later describe his father plainly, a man who told wonderful stories that were not true. The address for the bodies came from a storyteller, and his family said so. The Air Force went on the record in 1985, and I'll quote only the fragment that matters, that there had never been, nor have there ever been, extraterrestrial visitors or equipment at Wright-Patterson, nor have there ever been. It's a strange sentence for an institution to have to say out loud. Now, there is a real anecdote that gets pulled into this, and it deserves to be handled honestly rather than swallowed. Senator Barry Goldwater, a serious man, no crank, said that he once asked General Curtis LeMay for access to a rumored restricted room at Wright-Patterson, a blue room where the materials were supposedly kept, and he said LeMay refused him, sharply, and told him never to raise it again. That happened by Goldwater's own account. But look at what it is. It is a story about being told no. Goldwater never said he saw a body. He said he was refused a room. Do not let the blue room and Hangar 18 melt into each other. One is a locked door a senator got yelled at over. The other is a name a storyteller made famous. The building has an address now. It still has no tenants. A building is just a room until you put someone in it. The tenants arrive with the revival. For 30 years, Roswell was dead. Then, in 1978, a nuclear physicist named Stanton Friedman tracked down the one man from the original story, still willing to talk, Jesse Marcel, the intelligence major who had handled the debris. Marcel, decades on, said the material he touched was like nothing he'd seen, and that he'd never believed the balloon. Friedman believed him. And in 1980, a book, The Roswell Incident, by Charles Berlitz and William Moore, put the modern version into print for the first time. The dead story stood up and walked. Once it was walking, the bodies came. The most durable of them arrived through a Roswell mortician named Glenn Dennis, who surfaced in the late 1980s with a memory. Odd questions from the base about small caskets and preserving bodies exposed to the elements, and a nurse he knew, who told him she had seen unusual corpses and an examination. 31 years passed between the memo and the first body. The body is younger than the men remembering it. And the nurse? She is the exact place the story thins to nothing. Investigators could never securely establish her identity, or when she was supposed to have been there, or whether she existed as described at all. No nurse the records can name, no mortuary invoice, no examination the archive will confirm. The Air Force's second report, in 1997, Case Closed, offered a flat, unromantic answer for the later body memories. People were conflating decades of desert operations, parachute tests that dropped anthropomorphic test dummies from high altitude, and the real, tragic aftermath of military accidents. Anthropomorphic test dummies. It is a deflating phrase, and it may not cover every account, but it is on the record. The autopsy is not. This is the real soil the autopsy grew in. Sincere, second-hand, late, and impossible to close a hand around. Now the room fills. What it needed next was a face. For 50 years the body had no face. Then, in 1995, it got one on television, and the face was made of latex. The ground was prepared by a researcher named Leonard Stringfield, starting in 1978 with a paper he called Retrievals of the Third Kind, and continuing through a run of what he titled Status Reports. Stringfield collected account after account of crashed disks and recovered bodies. The trouble with all of it was the same trouble. His sources were anonymous, retired officers who wouldn't be named, friends of friends, men described only by rank and a promise. Anonymous source. Anonymous source. Anonymous source. That is the shape of Stringfield's archive, and it is the archive the picture would inherit. Because in 1995, a British producer named Ray Santilli released footage, grainy, black and white, a body on a table, gloved hands, a room. He presented it as film of an autopsy performed after the Roswell recovery. It ran on television in country after country. Millions of people watched a Gray get opened, and for a great many of them, that footage is still what the word Roswell means. The pathologists who looked at it were not gentle. The forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht, asked to make sense of what was being removed from the torso, said flatly that he could not relate these structures to abdominal context. Another, the veteran medical examiner Dominic DeMaio, gave the shortest review in this entire story. He said he would call it a lot of bull, a lot of bull. A third noted what the film conspicuously lacked technical verisimilitude, the look of a real procedure. It didn't have it. And then the film came apart completely. A special effects artist named John Humphreys eventually described building the bodies himself. Casts and latex and animal remains dressed up as organs, and said that the gloved pathologist moving through the frame, hidden behind a suit, was him. So walk the layer back. A body, built of latex, filmed by the man who built it, presented as evidence, believed by millions, and grafted onto a 50-year-old memo about foil in a field. Watch the picture, do the work the paper never could. The face was the most persuasive thing the legend ever produced, and the face was manufactured, on purpose, by a named man who told us so. Which leaves the last layer. Not a building, not a body, not a picture, a diagnosis. The most specific thing anyone claims to know about this body's insides was published 50 years after it supposedly died, in a memoir, by a man who never said he stood in the room. The man was Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, and the book, from 1997, was The Day After Roswell. Corso was real, and his career was real, a U.S. Army officer from the 40s into the 60s, a stint on the National Security Council staff under Eisenhower, later work in Army research and development on foreign technology. That is the documented man. What the memoir added was everything the modern legend now recites as fact, that the beings had no ordinary digestive system, no waste system, that what moved inside them wasn't blood as we mean it, but some pale, lymph-like fluid, that the skin itself did the work, a permeable surface, an exchange membrane, more like the outside of a plant than the hide of an animal. And from all of that, a conclusion, that these were not evolved creatures at all, but engineered ones, manufactured humanoids, biological machines built for the trip. Here's where the story shows its stitching. Every one of those details, the missing gut, the plant-like skin, the engineered verdict, traces to Corso's book, not to a pathology report, not to a government finding, to a memoir, published for sale, half a century on. And I am attaching those claims to that memoir and to nothing else, because there is nothing else to attach them to. And then there is the one word, the word that rides on top of every retelling of this story, the one in the thumbnail and the title, chlorophyll, a chlorophyll-based biology, plant chemistry where the blood should be. I went looking for where chlorophyll came from. I looked in Corso, who gave us the plant analogy but not that word. I looked at the film. I looked at the Air Force. I could not find a first source. No pathology report, no specimen, no first source for the single word everyone repeats. It seems to have simply grown on the story, no root, no seed anyone can point to, just there, greener each year. The most confident claim in the whole legend is the one with no origin at all, which is a strange place to have arrived. So let me hand the microphone for a while to the people whose entire job is to say so. Now let me make the strongest case against everything I've just walked you through, because it is a good case, and it is not mine alone. Karl Plock made it from inside the field. Plock was no debunker by temperament. He was a former government official who spent years investigating Roswell because he took it seriously. And at the end of that work, he concluded the evidence did not support a crashed craft, and that Project Mogul was the best explanation for the debris. When a man who wanted it to be true says it isn't, that is worth more than 100 confident skeptics. Joe Nickell made the case about the film, gathering the pathologist's objections and the fabrication account into one unsentimental conclusion. The Air Force made it in 2 official reports, and in 2024, the Pentagon's own historical review of decades of UFO records, produced by the office called AARO, stated that it had found no verifiable evidence that no case it examined showed extraterrestrial technology, and no evidence existed that the government or private industry had ever possessed any, no verifiable evidence. From the office built specifically to look, put at full strength, their case is this: the autopsy is folklore, assembled over decades out of late testimony, anonymous retrieval stories, a confessed hoax film, ordinary memory error, and the reinterpretation of real but earthly secrets. And I want to be plain with you. I am not going to tell you they're wrong. On the anatomy, I think they're right. There is nothing to verify. So let me concede it completely, and then narrow. The anatomy is unsupported. Every organ in it is unsupported. What survives the one hard, cold fact left standing when everything unverified is cleared away is small. An authenticated memo said the object was going to Wright Field. The government's own later search found no record of what happened when it got there. That gap is real. Nothing in 50 years has filled it. The best argument for the story is that so many people tell the same one. That is also the best reason to distrust it. Agreement isn't corroboration. Here is what the accounts share: small humanoid bodies, a military technical facility, an examination, an interior that doesn't match ours, and a body that reads as built rather than born. Lay them side by side and the overlap looks like a fingerprint. It looks like independent witnesses converging on a truth. But look at the calendar again, because the calendar dissolves it. 1974, Carr gives us the Hangar. Late 70s, Stringfield circulates the standardized bodies. 1980, the book puts it all in print. 1995, the film shows millions of people exactly what the autopsy is supposed to look like. 1997, Corso supplies the interior, 5 layers, and every witness who spoke after 1980 had all of them available before they opened their mouths. That's not a fingerprint. That's an echo in a room where everyone has read the same books and seen the same film. Similarity across contaminated sources is exactly what a shared culture produces. It is not what a shared event requires. Real independence would look like the opposite accounts from before the imagery existed, isolated from one another, in different languages, from people who couldn't have been coached. This story has almost none of that. What it has is a very successful set of images, repeated back with conviction. The conviction is real. It just isn't evidence. There is a version of this where the silence is the proof. I don't think the paper supports it. Read the silence carefully. Yes, Roswell base records were destroyed. Yes, the GAO found no examination file at Wright Field. Yes, the National Archives has no Blue Book Roswell document. Stack those absences up, and it is genuinely tempting to see a hand sweeping the shelves clean. But an empty file is not a hidden file. A destroyed record is not proof of what it held. And the likelier explanation is also the most boring one, which, in my experience, is usually the tell. Records get destroyed on schedules, clerks check boxes. Paper from the 40s was disposed of by the ton, under routine authority, by people who had never heard of a flying saucer and were only clearing a shelf. The disposition form the GAO actually found looks exactly like that. Unsigned, routine, unremarkable. And notice what is missing from the cover-up itself. A real suppression leaves wreckage careers ended, funding pulled, people silenced and bitter. Here there is none of that traceable to this autopsy. No ruined biologist, no defunded lab, no one who paid. The record doesn't show an institution hiding a result. It shows a memo that reaches Wright Field once and then produces nothing. The anatomy was built to fill that silence not reported from inside it. Before the building and the bodies and the diagnosis, there was a kitchen floor in Roswell, and a boy looking at something his father brought home. The father was Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer. The night he collected it, he stopped home and spread some on the floor for his family. His son was a child then, and for the rest of his life he remembered one thing more sharply than the rest: small markings along a little beam of the wreckage, figures he could never quite read, not a body, not an autopsy. A boy on a kitchen floor, wondering about some marks on a stick. That is the human residue of the real event. One man who never believed the balloon, one child turning over a detail he couldn't name. Set it beside the 50-year anatomy, the hangar, the nurse, the latex, the missing gut, the chlorophyll, and the difference is the whole story. One is small and unresolved and real. The other is enormous and specific and sourced to no one. So I'll end where the archivist always ends, not with an answer, but with the questions the record leaves on the floor. Why does a one-line memo need 50 years of anatomy? Why did every organ arrive later than the last, and never earlier? Why is the body younger than the men who remember it? Why did the face appear only once there was film to show it, and why was the film built of latex? Why is the most confident detail the most recently invented? Where did the word chlorophyll come from, if not from Corso, not the film, not the Air Force? If a laboratory hid a result, where is the wreckage that hiding leaves? Why does the story need Wright Field, and would it survive if that building had never been secret? What did a boy actually see on a kitchen floor in 1947? Why do we trust the agreement of people who all read the same books? If the drawer is empty, why are we so sure something was taken out of it? And if there is nothing there to find, why can't any of us stop looking? The file says the object went to Wright Field. It never says what came back. 50 years later, we have a missing stomach, a skin like a leaf, a verdict of engineered, and not one page from 1947 to hang any of it on. So the question isn't what they found, it's why we keep building it. And I don't have that page either.